Thank you for taking the time to watch this episode of Life Support. If you enjoy the content, we would ask that you like it, hit subscribe, and share it with your friends. Hey, I'm so glad that you've joined us on Life Support. And what we do on this podcast is we tell stories to help you find a deeper relationship with Jesus through suffering and trauma. And it's really fun to hear people's stories. The pain's not fun, but the outcome when Jesus intervenes is remarkable. And we've got a man who knows a lot about that. His name is Glen Bloomstrom. He's a chaplain, retired, but he's now the director of faith community engagement of Living Works. And I was kind of reading through your bio here, Glen. Very impressive military things here, but you seem to be a lot more passionate about what we're going to talk about today. So it's so great to have you.
That's right, Paul. It's a pleasure to be here again.
Yeah, and we talked, during the pandemic, I think, when things were kind of getting geared up last time, and we got through that.
Yes, we did, didn't we?
I think.
Well,
I think.
Yeah, we're still back to masks now, I think. I was traveling a few days ago, and they recommend masks, so here we are again, yeah.
Well, you don't have to wear a mask with us.
Okay,
and
thanks.
if we're in a bad mood, we'll make you, you'll put one on. Tell me what Living Works does.
All right, well, Living Works is a international suicide intervention training company. They're headquartered in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. But they have offices around the world, Australia, USA. There's about 7,500 trainers, and we train about 50,000 people every year in suicide intervention skills. Wow.
So you got a lot going on there. And how did you get involved with it? Where did you find out about it?
Well, that's a great question. I was, as you've already said, I was a chaplain on active duty. And at a point in my life, I was involved with policy development and training for all, at that time, I think there were about 4,600 chaplains, active, guard, and reserve. And we were wanting to train chaplains in suicide intervention. Intervention meaning what to do when somebody's thinking of suicide. So we were doing lectures, PowerPoint, stuff like that.
Yeah.
And then I was introduced to a Living Works program, Living Works Applied Suicide Intervention Skill Training. And as soon as I went through that, I said, this is what chaplains need. And so the rest is history. I retired and then was kind of recruited by them to come back, and I've been with them for 10 years.
Wow. So suicide to some is very close and personal. To some, it's kind of an abstract concept. Tell me why this is so important right now in our culture to talk about this.
Well said, Paul. It is abstract until you've experienced it. Mm-hmm. And many, many people in our culture have experienced it. But it's a taboo topic. No one wants to talk about suicide, and especially if they've had a member who struggled, attempted, or died by suicide. It's a very personal thing. But we're seeing more and more people thinking of suicide. Our culture is moving, especially among young adults. I read somewhere statistically that 1 in 4 of our young adults, 14 to 24, have thought about suicide. That's 25%. Mm-hmm. And at any given time, they say that 1 in 20, 5% of people around us are thinking of suicide at any given moment.
Yeah, and they don't even often list it as a cause of death, and so it's almost like it's hidden under the rug, huh?
That's for sure. In fact, I read another article just yesterday. We've always talked about this 22 veteran deaths a day. And I think a couple years ago, they revised that down to about 17. But there's new research that said that there could be as high as 40 suicides deaths by suicide a day if you consider opioid overdoses and other kinds of things. There is really massive underreporting of suicide deaths in our country.
So tell me why in that particular community you just mentioned, veterans, what are the underlying issues that push that number up so high?
Well, first and foremost, the vast majority are men. Mm-hmm. These are men that are familiar with weapons. These are many men who have experienced deep trauma. And if they've gotten a job, a good job after they've left the service, the highest number of those dying by suicide are still our Vietnam-era veterans. They're in their mid to late 60s, early 70s now. And what happens is you've got a purpose, you're going to work, you're keeping busy, but now you're on Social Security. And oh, by the way, you're estranged from your spouse, you're estranged from your children because for years, for decades, you've been self-medicating. And so all of the things that kind of keep a veteran going frequently. Now this, please don't stereotype this.
No.
But we see that a lack of purpose, a loss of relationships really leads to despair frequently. And so that leads, if not checked, that leads to attempts and deaths by suicide. I
can only imagine. Now, I've never been in the military, so I don't know what that lifestyle is like. But I can only imagine it's a high adrenaline. When let's say you're in Vietnam, you're on the edge all the time. You're seeing stuff that you probably never thought you would see. You're trying to protect yourself and others, and all of a sudden you come home, you're not welcomed. Controversial war. And now you've gone to the other extreme where you've got, like, why am I going to get out of bed this morning? And that's got to be really a hard adjustment.
Right. That transition for Vietnam era, GWAT era, Global War on Terrorism, and then our Iraq and Afghan wars, that transition is the hardest. And we find that until a young person now from our contemporary wars makes that transition often to school or vocational training and gets into a good job, that's what's needed, purposeful living and a supportive family. But we know that in our culture more and more, our young people are estranged from their extended family for various reasons, or they've not had a father figure. And so the military provided structure. You knew what to do. There was a reason to get up. You had father figures and older brothers or sisters mentoring you. And, oh, let me just get out of this system. And then we go out and people don't care. I mean, they say thank you for your service.
Yeah.
But they don't know what that is.
Yeah.
And they might even stereotype you as, oh, here comes a ticking time bomb or that. And sometimes our young people who have had traumatic stress, it's sometimes a badge of that marks sets them apart, and so they do exhibit these behaviors. It's complicated.
Yeah.
But by and large, if a person is connected and has purpose and has made that transition, they're a lot less likely to find themselves struggling with depression or substance abuse and then making that transition.
Glen Bloomstrom is our guest from Living Works, and he's talking to us today about suicide intervention, the training chaplains and so forth to deal with this really difficult topic. Now, in Minnesota, we're the land of the 10,000 lakes. We've got we're the prized few up here in the Northland, and you don't really think of Minnesota as a place that would be affected by this problem, but tell me if it is.
Well,
true.
we're just like the other 50 states. So there was some research that came out, a study from 2017 or 1999 to 2017, and across the board in America, suicide has increased significantly. I think it's in the high 50% over those decades, and Minnesota is just like every other state. Yeah. Also, we're kind of in the middle in terms of our suicide rates. I was just out in Montana last week. They're number 3. Number 1 is Alaska, and number 2 is Wyoming. Smaller populations, but extremely independent. So we have a mixture in our state. We have rural, who are hardworking, self-sufficient, independent. I'll do it on my own, thank you. And they've done it for generations, the rates outside of the metro are higher than the rates in metropolitan areas. They
Wow.
are, yeah. And so the states like Wyoming, Alaska, Wyoming, and Montana, 1, 2, and 3, you've got a lot of folks out there that are more independent and a lot more isolated.
Mm-hmm. Do you find that when you're talking to others about what you actually do at Living Works, that eyes kind of glaze over, like, well, why are you telling me this, and why is it important to me? And or do people focus right in and say, like, yeah, I know somebody, or I'm worried about my kids, or that kind of reaction?
That's a great question. I think it's the latter. People are interested. They said, hey, what do you do? Well, I'm in suicide intervention training. You know, when I was flying back a couple of days ago, what do you do? Well, I teach people how to talk to people about suicide. And they kind of go, wow, really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You don't hear that every day, right?
Yeah, right. They say, tell me more. And then I talk to them. You know, I really focus on clergy and military, but a lot of people are not trained. So an analogy I like to use is like CPR. You know, there's a lot of people in America that know CPR. They've never used it. But across the board, a lot more people are trained in CPR than are in suicide intervention skills. You might never use it. But if suicide's not on the radar, this is my elevator speech, if suicide's not on the radar, you won't ask. And if you don't go to a training where you practice asking and know what to do, you probably will miss invitations that people are sending to you to ask them about suicide.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's important. I like what you just said. And as a pastor, I've encountered people many times that share things with me that are troubling, frightening. Sometimes I know what to do and say. Sometimes I don't know what to do and say. And then it's almost like a panic attack, because you go, like, if that person walks out of here and I haven't done the right thing, you know, what's going to happen? And so this is really valuable, because, you know, our culture is one that is becoming more and more isolated, I think. People are less and less likely to share with you what's really going on, and if they do, you need to know what to do next.
Yes. And in the suburban church and the evangelical church, people in small groups might share. But when they are coming to the pastor, they have just walked over a big hurdle to talk about an issue. And in my studies, in work with pastors, a lot of pastors, well, 1/3 have zero training in suicide intervention. Our people assume they do. And another 1/3 have less than 5 hours of training. So many churches don't even do counseling. Everything's referred out. Mm-hmm. And so our people expect, you know, our pastors to be trained. So when that topic comes up, it's frightening, because we begin to think more about ourselves. You know, oh, how am I gonna deal with this? And our heart starts to beat. Yep. You know, we're afraid. We don't want somebody to die under our watch in our church. So all those are factors: a lack of training, it's a controversial and difficult topic, and then secondly, I begin to think more about myself than the person that I'm trying to help. So
yeah, that becomes a mixture that can go bad quickly there. Mm-hmm. This is Glen Bloomstrom, and he's from Living Works, and we're talking about suicide prevention and training. And you mentioned you're dealing with chaplains, you're dealing with clergy, and you mentioned veterans before, and I just want to follow up on that real quickly, because, you know, we all at some level know somebody who's a veteran. My dad, my uncles, all served, and so that was part of my family, even though my brother and I didn't. Are we as a country taking care of our veterans in this area, or are they kind of left to fend for themselves?
Oh, I think we're making huge efforts to help veterans. You know, our VA system, they're very well funded. They have very, very good intentions, but very few veterans access them. Mm-hmm. You know, that's one issue. I think there's also a much more of a sense of gratitude toward veterans than what we hear the experience was for our Vietnam era veterans.
Yeah.
However, I think that there's extremes. On one hand, thank you for your service. You were a veteran. Wow, thanks for keeping us free. Thanks for what you did, which is wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, there's a perception if somebody is struggling or looks pretty intense, there might be the stigmatization that, oh boy, that's a hair trigger veteran over there, and
ticking time bomb,
right?
huh?
And we don't know what to do with them. And a lot of our veterans look pretty tough,
Yep.
a big beard, lots of tats, driving a Harley,
Yeah.
A couple of colorful words in what they say, and what's that about? That's about who they are, their image. And so, I think for people of faith, for uncles, aunts, grandparents, we just need to look beyond that surface thing and say, how are you? How's your transition? What's happening in your life? And look beyond. And I think people from my generation, you see that exterior and say, ooh, man, I don't know if I want to go there. And when you start to talk to a veteran that's kind of got that gruff exterior, you'll find a gentle, kind heart, if you take the time.
If you take the time, yeah.
That's it, yeah.
What are some other things that we can do when we run up against someone or we know somebody that we think might be in danger?
Well, first and foremost, I think take advantage of the resources that are there. At a minimum, if you're having a conversation with someone and you've had no training, the best thing you can do is go on your speakerphone and, well, the best thing you can do is just ask, have you been thinking of suicide?
Mm-hmm.
You've got to use that word, suicide. Not, are you thinking of harming yourself? Are you thinking of hurting yourself? Or you're not thinking of this, which kind of says, don't tell me yes.
Yeah.
I don't want to hear yes.
Yeah, that's right.
But if you're concerned, you're having a conversation, one of the easiest resources after you've asked that question is dial 988. It's the new suicide hotline number. And put it on speaker and say, hey, I'm here with my friend. He's been going through a lot of hard things, and I just asked him about suicide. If you don't know even any resources, but you're there with them, you're on the speakerphone with somebody who's most likely trained in a Living Works Assist that I mentioned before.
Huh? Yeah.
It is the standard for crisis line workers. Paul, if I were king, every pastor and ministry leader in every parachurch ministry would be trained in Assist. It's 2 days. But anyway, you're going to get on the speakerphone. You're there. You're not going to leave them alone. Where should we turn? What can we do? The crisis line worker will give some resources, and then we turn to that person and say, what sounds good to you? I'm not leaving you alone. We're going to go together, and I'm going to sit with you. So the other thing is, a lot of the times people will think, I'm going to take him to the emergency room. Well, emergency room has pros and cons. Yes, it's a good place to go, but it costs money, and you could sit there for a long time. I was doing a workshop one time in my home church, downtown Minneapolis, Bethlehem Baptist, and I was, going through my standard material, and a mom came up to me and said, I took my daughter, and I won't name where it was, and we sat there for 4 hours, and there were psychotic people, and there were people in crisis who were overdosing. They came through that door. And we were both kind of traumatized by what we saw.
Right.
And after we left, after she was evaluated and assessed 4 or 5 hours, she turned to me and said, Mom, I'm never going to tell you if I'm ever in crisis again. That was horrible. So that's where having a pastor, a youth pastor trained in a evidence-based training who knows what to do calmly. I know Pastor Johnson, I know my youth leader. Let's talk about this. Are you thinking about suicide? And we have others in the church that are known that can do a more comprehensive suicide intervention assessment and safety plan. you do it among people you know, and then you go to external resources. So that would be the thing I would say.
That's a really good answer, and I like what you said. Use the word, and I think most commonly you'll hear, "Are you going to hurt yourself?"
Yes.
Because people don't like saying the word suicide.
Right. It is scary.
It is scary.
Uh-huh. And that all feeds into the taboo. These are adults in relatively good health. In some cases, it could be a senior who has been diagnosed with a terminal illness. But just the thought of somebody ending their own lives, theologically, we struggle with that. And there's a whole history of stigma that has began in the church, really with the church fathers, became law. And if you read some of the history of stigma in Western countries, that's why it's so taboo and we're frightened by it. But also, to the friends we knew and throughout our lifetime, we knew them. And again, we remember them full of life, and it's very difficult. We have guilt often that we didn't know what to do, and that happened.
Yeah.
So all that ties into the fear of using the word suicide.
Well, you have used it, and you know what you're doing. So how do you access Living Works? And if I'm interested as a pastor or a layperson, or how do I get training through Living Works?
Well, we have online training. One is like a 90-minute training, Living Works Start. So if you just go to www.livingworks.net, in about 10 minutes, you can be having a very basic, skill-based, evidence-based training called Living Works Start. But we do face-to-face training. I do face-to-face training here in Minnesota. We have a lot of faith-based people in Minnesota that can teach face-to-face training from 4 hours to 2 days.
That's good to know. Okay, and the website would be what?
www.livingworks.net.
Okay, it's really important stuff, because we're to take care of our fellow man, our fellow believer.
Amen.
And we can't just discount this and pass it off to somebody else.
Love the neighbor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think Jesus said something about that.
I think so.
Glenn, we're going to have you back, and we got some more to talk about, but I'm so glad you've been here. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for the time.